This is episode 328 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Jordan McGillis. He is Deputy Director of Policy with the Institute for Energy Research. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Jordan.
Thank you, sir. Good to be with you.
Yeah, and you and your organization are involved in a variety of energy research and policy issues. First and foremost, I was on your podcast, so why don't we get started? Talk a little bit about your organization and
Sure.
the podcast that I was a part of, and any directions you want to give people to that podcast.
Okay. So we are a Washington, D.C. based energy policy think tank. And much like your organization, we advocate for free markets. That's what we're all about. And with that comes, in our view, affordability, reliability, and energy security. And we talk a lot about federal policy, but we engage at the state level as well. I had you on our podcast recently. We've done things in other states as well. One of the topics we'll discuss today is the advanced clean cars rule. And for example, we've worked with the Minnesota-based free market think tank, the Center of the American Experiment, on this issue as well. We've submitted comments up there. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in Minnesota, but we engage at the state level quite regularly. I recently wrote a paper with the North Carolina-based John Locke Foundation on their electricity policy. So state level policies are very important to us, and we view that as on an equal par to the federal policy. So really important that we have these conversations in each of our laboratories of democracy, and make sure that we are giving every state and the citizens in those states the best chance to have an affordable, reliable energy future. The work I've done in New Mexico and that you and I have talked about, I believe, pertain to oil and gas leasing and the great productivity that the state of New Mexico has demonstrated in that regard.
Yeah, and let's talk about cars in New Mexico, broadly speaking, because our governor, of course, as I've talked about on this podcast before, she's a Democrat. She's of the type of Democrat that is definitely trying to placate the radical environmental groups, but also likes spending the money that the oil and gas industry brings in. So she hasn't done a lot to really crack down on the industry itself here in New Mexico. That would be cutting off her nose to spite her face. But with regard to automobiles and individual freedom, basically, she's taken on these policies. And you and I talked a while back, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because the governor and her administration are currently in the rulemaking process relating to what's called a clean car standard. Essentially, California implemented this. Talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we need to be very careful with our language, and the more we talk about clean cars, the stronger the argument is for the other side. So I think I might call it the California cars rule, something like that. But basically, if we look back on the history here, when the US started to get serious about environmental policy in the 1970s, the epicenter of that was California, and Los Angeles in particular had a significant smog problem at the time. It has a somewhat unique geography, being a sort of a low-lying basin that's ringed by mountains with the ocean air, and it creates this pool of smog. The ozone can't really escape out of that basin. So when the federal government implemented the Clean Air Act in the ensuing years, there's an extension of special considerations for California that allowed the state to set sharper rules for its own state, but it also gave other states a chance to sign on to California standards if and only if other states do exactly what California has done. But it's important to remember that in the 1970s, as we formed the Clean Air Act and California established these standards, this was driven by local air pollution, the things that make people sick, the things that can affect the quality of life and affect agriculture, that sort of thing. Very different from climate change, very different from greenhouse gas emissions. A second factor that sort of built on top of these Clean Air Act standards and the California special exemptions was the 1970s petroleum crisis. That was largely government imposed, and in public memory, people think it was because the oil cartel cut down production, but really the Nixon price controls, which incidentally were instituted 50 years ago this week, those are what led up to the oil crisis in the 1970s. As a result of that crisis, the government put into place what's known as the corporate average fuel economy. And these are fuel economy standards, fuel economy mandates, we like to say, that require automakers to sell vehicles across their fleet that meet a certain miles per gallon standard. And that has been ticking up over the years. There's kind of a timetable that's laid out. The Obama administration amplified that. The Trump administration brought it back down. But on that front as well, California has its own set of standards. And that's part of this California CARS rule that New Mexico is potentially going to adopt. So the California CARS rule establishes certain fuel economy requirements, meaning all of the cars that a maker sells need to have an average MPG that it's rapidly climbing towards something like 50 miles per gallon. So quite a significant ways above what standard vehicles these days get. That's what's called the low emissions vehicle element of it, the LEV, L-E-V, the LEV element. The second part of the California CARS rule is zero emission vehicles. So that's EVs in particular, and hydrogen cars. So what the adoption of the California CARS rules means for a state is that automakers will be required to deliver to that state a certain percentage of vehicles that are part of this ZEV standard, the ZEV, and that's climbing toward 22%. So by 2025, automakers will be required by law to provide 1/5 essentially of their stock to a state in electric vehicles. The other aspect of it is that fuel economy. So that's more broad. It refers to the fuel economy of the entire fleet. Both of these have significant economic effects and just economic liberty effects for a state. First, the low emission vehicle element of it, the fuel economy aspect. We all know that we prefer to get more miles to the gallon. That's something that's already built into the market. We don't need government to be putting in place standards that are already incentivized by the price system. When I drive I have a Volkswagen diesel, and part of the reason why I got it is because it gets exceptional miles to the gallon. And that's a big factor for me. I'm into energy policy, so I was attracted to that. Other people have other considerations. If you may be doing more hauling, you need a larger vehicle, you have a larger family, you're still factoring in the price of fuel, but it may not be your leading consideration. And this fuel economy mandate adds significantly to the cost of all vehicles because the manufacturers are adjusting their production and potentially adjusting their prices. That's a bit more tenuous, but to try to get to their sales weighted average, we think they're probably building in subsidies actually. The effect is cars are more expensive. One report says that the difference between the Obama era standard and the Trump slight reduction on that fuel economy standard would have been $1,000. So you'd save $1,000 on a vehicle up front with those slightly more reasonable Trump standards. A paper from the Heritage Foundations came out in, I think, 2016. They said it was actually about $3,000 that the CAFE mandate overall has added to vehicle cost. There hasn't been a ton of work done on the California additional increment on top of it, but if the CAFE standard, corporate average fuel economy, adds $3,000 or $3,500 to a vehicle, we would obviously know that the higher California requirement would add even more. So the big argument that you'll get from proponents is that it's okay because you'll make up that money in the form of lower fuel costs. And they apply this argument even more strongly when they're talking about the electric vehicles. There's a big problem there. If I'm paying $1,000 more upfront or even $3,500 upfront more, that's money that I could do other things with. So even if in the long run, I'm paying a little bit more in fuel cost, they often say that you'll save about $1,400 over the lifetime of an EV on fuel relative to a gasoline or diesel powered vehicle. But if I'm paying over $1,000 upfront, I'm missing out on the market gains I could be getting. If I invest that $1,000 today, I'll have way more than $1,400 over the course of a vehicle's lifetime. So it's a really disingenuous argument. that money upfront is very important. And that's a big reason why people are apprehensive to buy electric vehicles and some of these higher efficiency vehicles, is that they're more expensive, and that the bottom line is cost matters, and it matters a lot more today than it does spread out over the course of a vehicle's lifetime. So,
well, Jordan,
yes.
I think the fundamental issue here in a place like New Mexico, and I know in the DC area or even most of California, folks tend to drive smaller vehicles, but you come out to New Mexico, and not just the rural communities, but the urban communities. Consumer preference is clearly on the side of SUVs or large pickup trucks, vehicles that, I mean, yeah, there's electric versions. I guess Ford just came out with a electric 150, F-150, but the tendency is that people want bigger vehicles. I mean, is that something that is going to shift? Obviously, you mentioned the kind of cross subsidy thing where I guess the news articles say, and we haven't seen finalized regulations, 7 to 10% of vehicles in New Mexico would be required to be ZEV. So that means not your Prius, that's a Tesla or some electric vehicle. There's going to have to be some kind of cross subsidy in order to encourage people to buy those vehicles. That means other prices are going up on the bigger vehicles, or people are going to be buying them from other states. I think Texas is a safe bet. Has that, obviously these are relatively new policies, but what have you seen in other states that have adopted them? Has that already taken place where they're actually going out and buying vehicles out of state or not?
I don't know about the buying vehicles out of state thing. I think that there are so many factors that you'd have to take into account, including the different sales tax environments in different states that are also influencing that. And obviously the pure distance from, if you live in Albuquerque, it's a bit of a drive to get to another state versus if you live in Connecticut and you can easily get into New York or something. So I don't know about that, but the cross subsidy issue is something that we really want to explore at the Institute for Energy Research. We just haven't put rubber to the road on that yet. But to get clear on what we believe is happening there is that in order for automakers and dealers to induce people to buy electric vehicles or hybrids, what we think is probably happening is that they're in their price structure reducing their sticker price on those vehicles, and then just upping them a little bit on the vehicles that are more popular. So you're seeing people pay a little bit less for the EVs, meaning they're more likely to buy them. And the more popular vehicles, there's a little bit, there is price sensitivity, of course, but people still want, as you said, those larger SUVs and trucks in high demand these days. So we'd love to get some more data on it. Don't quite have it, but we think there is that cross subsidization happening. And remember, that comes on top of the public policy subsidy, which is $7,500 for an EV buyer for when they're buying a vehicle from a manufacturer that has not yet hit the cap, which I believe is 200,000 units. So significant subsidization is going on. And to the consumer choice point, that's a term, much like clean cars, that I think we need to be very skeptical of, because consumer choice is met on a free and open market. Dealers and manufacturers want to provide vehicles that people want to buy. And if you're in a small market, it may be the case that you're not able to get the exact thing you want. I live in suburban San Diego right now, and I used to live in the Bay Area in San Francisco. I would love if I could go to the French Laundry, the famous restaurant here in San Diego. Why don't we have a French Laundry? I don't have consumer choice if we don't have the famous French Laundry restaurant, do I? No, that's a ridiculous argument. The market is going to meet demand incrementally. It's sometimes a slow process. And this can be extended to the EV infrastructure point, where we're now in this new infrastructure bill coming from the federal government, potentially going to spend $7.5 billion on EV chargers. The market can meet the demand if the demand is demonstrated, and we just need to give it time. And that's what I think would be a smarter policy on EVs, is to allow interest and demand to be demonstrated on the free market, and then for suppliers, for manufacturers, for EV charging companies to match that. But people have very specific needs for vehicles, and the EV isn't going to get the job done in a lot of cases. I actually had the pleasure of helping my father-in-law this weekend with a very heavyweight delivery. He's a blacksmith, and he was selling some of his machinery to a gentleman up in Northern California. So we drove in his pickup truck. It's a Nissan Frontier. So, a kind of a mid-market, mid-size pickup. And we calculated very specifically what our MPG was, what our intervals were that we were able to drive, because I had in the back of my mind that I wanted to compare it to the vehicle you mentioned, which was the Ford F-150 Lightning. This is the new electric pickup, and Ford is saying, we've cracked the code. We know people love pickups, but they also want to be cleaner and greener. And so they're going to provide this EV truck. But all of the data indicate that electric vehicles simply cannot get the job done when you have actual demands like hauling a couple thousand pounds of machinery 500 miles. So what I calculated is that with the Ford F-150 Lightning, our equivalent range, how far we can go per charge, will be reduced to about 60 miles before we'd have to recharge. And that's because the battery simply can't operate at its peak efficiency when it's under such strain. Now, you could say, well, a gasoline vehicle can't go as far when it's pulling a load either. No, but the baseline range is so much higher when you have the density of fuel that comes from gasoline or diesel. So in this Nissan Frontier at an 18-gallon tank, and we were getting about 12.5 miles to the gallon, towing. It was probably somewhere in the ballpark of 4,000, 5,000 pounds of machinery. So 12.5 is pretty bad, but that's still getting us, close to 200 miles per leg before we would refuel. Refueling takes 10 minutes when you're just popping the gas nozzle into the tank. With an EV, you're getting, in this scenario, would have been getting about 60 miles per leg, and then we would have to spend 30 minutes using a charger, because even these superchargers, they call them, take half an hour, and that's just getting you to 80% charge. So doing real work isn't going to be very feasible with this F-150 Lightning. Now, it's perfectly fine vehicle if you're driving around the suburbs, if you're going out and you're inspecting meters and you just want to look like you're blue collar, so you get a truck. But it's not doing the job that you often need trucks to do, especially as a small business person who can't buy a whole fleet. So I'm very skeptical of the Ford F-150 Lightning.
Yeah, well, without getting too far down the road, because there are other things I want to talk to you about. I mean, are electric vehicles really that green as a general concept?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's mining, of course,
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be done for all the batteries, disposal of the batteries. You're going to have to deploy a very significant network of charging stations, and who pays
Mm-hmm.
for those? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
work through some of those big picture problems with
Mm-hmm.
electric vehicles.
Okay. Couple big points. Since the 1970s, last 5 decades, last 50 years, we've reduced in the United States our criteria pollutants, which are the things that actually affect your health at the ground level. We've reduced those by 74%. Okay, so it needs to be understood that we're doing a great job on efficiency and on getting cleaner air. And a colleague and I wrote a paper on this last year. It's called Breathe Easier. You can find that at instituteforenergyresearch.org. Again, the paper is titled Breathe Easier. And that gets into how much better we are at being efficient and at having cleaner energy usage year by year. Now, how do EVs contribute to that? This is, again, where we need to be very clear regarding the distinction between local air pollution, which is the stuff that we're all against, and greenhouse gas emissions, which are a completely different form of waste. And there's a whole argument to be had about whether it constitutes pollution, but it needs to be understood that it's two very different things: local air pollution and the emissions that increase the greenhouse effect. So on that GHG side of things, how do EVs contribute, positively or negatively? Well, they really only are beneficial in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions if you also have sources of electricity that are low or zero emitting. And I believe in the state of New Mexico, you get about 2/3 of your electricity from coal and natural gas. Get a pretty big chunk from wind and solar as well. but coal and natural gas are the leading sources of electricity in New Mexico, as they are across the US. And so these alleged improvements in emissions need to take into account, well, what's the electricity coming from? Okay, that's the first thing. So you've already lost some of your environmental claim there when we look at what the effect is of the electricity source. But on the local air pollution level, that's where at one time I really thought EVs were a very strong contributor. And my kind of perspective was, all right, the greenhouse gas emissions claim isn't very important to me, and it's probably tenuous, but hey, at least we're making local air pollution, the local air quality better. And maybe EVs can do that for us. But as I've learned more, I've realized that even that claim is significantly undermined by a couple of factors. And the biggest factor there is the weight of an electric vehicle. EVs are significantly heavier. I don't have a stat off the top of my head, but I think that they can be as much as 50% heavier than comparable vehicles. And this Ford F-150 Lightning versus the regular Ford F-150 is an example of that. When you have a heavier vehicle, you're creating more contact with the road in terms of force on the road. And so you're degrading your tires more than you do on a standard vehicle. And actually, the degradation of tires and of brakes is the biggest part of local air pollution. It's not from the tailpipe, believe it or not. And I can cite a study. There's a study from Scotland, University of Edinburgh, and they found in 2016 that non-exhaust sources of emissions, meaning from the tires and from the brakes, account for 90% of the particulate matter that is emitted from a vehicle. So a significant amount of local air pollution is still going to be generated by electric vehicles. And because they're heavier, they actually do more of that than do conventional vehicles with other comparable qualities. So the environmental claim, even in terms of emissions, whether it's local air pollution or greenhouse gases, is shaky. And then you get to the point that you brought up, which is the mining, the disposal. Batteries entail significant environmental risk. And the International Energy Agency, which is, I believe, based out of Switzerland, they wrote a report in the spring of this year, early May, which discussed what they call the energy transition minerals. And they discuss how many, what percentage of cobalt, what percentage of lithium is coming from places of the world that do not meet environmental standards. The biggest one, of course, being China, other countries that are significantly involved in those supply chains. The biggest one would be Democratic Republic of the Congo. And there's a whole other factor we could get into there, which is labor. There's significant forced labor and quasi-forced labor going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to dig up the cobalt that goes into the electric batteries. So there's this environmental destruction. There's all of the tailings and wastewater going on at these mining facilities for the cobalt, for the lithium, and here in the Americas and in Australia, and then for things like the rare earth minerals that are mostly mined, mostly controlled by Chinese trade. So the environmental claims on mining are very, very bad for batteries. And then the disposal of EV batteries is a real problem as well. We have a fully developed market for disposing of and trading in your used car battery for a standard internal combustion engine vehicle. We don't yet have that for the battery for electric vehicles. So these things are just going to get dumped in landfills. They're going to leach chemicals that are toxic into our soil. And that's all verified by the EPA. This is a big hazard that's coming our way. And frankly, it extends across the entirety of the so-called energy transition. You see the same thing in solar panels, and you see significant problems in wind as well, because wind power relies on these rare earth minerals that are being mined in injudicious ways in China. And then how do you dispose of a wind turbine blade? You really just can't do it. It's too big. So the triumvirate of the so-called energy transition is wind power, solar power, and battery powered cars. They all have major environmental problems, and we need to take that into account when we make the environmental claim that we'll be reducing global warming.
Yeah, well, seems like the so-called environmentalists these days only care about one thing, and that's CO2. Every other environmental issue, it pales by a comparison. I was interacting online with representative350.org here about the proposal to mine, I believe, lithium in Greenland, which is a relatively untouched part of our planet. and they seemed fully on board with going ahead and mining in Greenland for the ostensible benefit of getting lithium for your zero emission vehicles, at least zero emission at the tailpipe, electric vehicles, et cetera. So, all right, well, thank you for a very good, detailed discussion of some of the issues with Governor Lujan Grisham and other states' proposals for zero emission vehicles and California standards. Unfortunately, that's not the only thing on the table here in New Mexico. In the meanwhile, at the same time, the governor is pushing for, in the next legislative session, new so-called low carbon fuel standards to force motorists that still use gasoline to somehow reduce by 10% the carbon intensity of fuel used for transportation. This would be by 2030, with that number being 28% by 2040. Are we talking ethanol at a epically increased level, which everybody, environmentalists included, seem to agree is not green? Switchgrass, I know there's been all kinds of issues in Washington on the so-called clean fuel standards. What are we going to be putting in our gas tanks if we do have a gas-powered vehicle?
Well, you bring up a good point there, which is that this is one environmental dispute on which many environmentalists have come to see some wisdom, and it's that biofuels in general offer a very bad trade-off environmentally. Even if you are reducing the carbon intensity of the fuel, you're exacting some significant costs environmentally elsewhere, and that comes in the form of the destruction of natural habitats for increased agricultural use. You have to use a lot of fuel to perform the agricultural tasks out there, whether this is in Iowa or if it's in Indonesia, where they're chopping down forests to do biodiesel. Significant environmental costs do come from that. There's also, on the other side of things, on the consumer side, some challenges to the operation of various forms of engines, smaller engines such as motorcycles, boats, ATVs, that sort of thing. I'm not an expert on this, but they don't operate as well with some of these higher blends of these so-called renewable fuels. And much like we talked about earlier, there's the conflation of local air pollution with greenhouse gas emissions, and we kind of had mission creep. We've also had mission creep on biofuels, the renewable fuel standard. This was implemented to get us off of quote unquote foreign oil. That was the biggest claim there. In the mid 2000s during the Bush administration, this was part of the Energy Security Act across the country, was to get us less oil from the Mid East and to use more locally grown biofuels. But the work that industry has done in New Mexico, in Texas, in North Dakota has undermined that justification entirely. We no longer have a problem with being on foreign oil. So they're trying to prop this sort of thing up with the global warming claim. And like I said, there's a significant other environmental cost that comes with it. So many of these policies have these long legacies that have brought in different justifications over time. Very hard to get them off the books, even when those justifications fade away.
Yeah, definitely a lot of information out there indicating that the ethanol and other forced use of those kinds of alternative fuels are not good for the environment and good for the vehicles themselves, all kinds of problems with them. And again, just our governor and potentially the legislature did die during the 2021 session and could die again soon. It was, I think, a shock to many that it died this session, but we shall see what the 30-day session has in store for us as consumers, vehicle drivers, and with the clean fuel standard here. I get the impression that, and maybe you have some insights on this. It seems that states are doing the zero emission vehicle transition or mandate administratively. Can you speak to that process and how you can make that requirement law to go along with California as an administrative issue without going through the legislative process?
Certainly not my area of expertise, but what you're suggesting sounds like a good idea to me. Let's put this to a democratic test and see if the legislatures in the states really want to implement this sort of policy. In Minnesota, where it was just put into place, it was through an administrative process. There was a proposed rule, then a period of open comment, and the Institute for Energy Research we weighed in and made our case, as did many other organizations, including the aforementioned Sierra Club that you mentioned. And ultimately, went to the governor's desk and he signed it. And the judges in Minnesota decided that this was within the purview granted to the governor as part of their existing energy or emissions policy that they had in place. So I think a broader challenge for us across the country in the state legislatures, our national legislature, is that we need very clear and explicit environmental policy that doesn't grant too much leeway to the governor in the administrative state or the president in the administrative state to go beyond the bounds of what people really think is in their best interest on energy and the environment.
Yeah, it just seems very strange to me that if you want to change the fuel makeup at the pump that people actually purchase when they go to a gas station, that has to go through the legislative process, but mandating up to 10% of your vehicle fleet as a state be zero emissions, somehow that can be done through the administrative process, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But we will do our best to figure these things out. And unfortunately, as we've seen over the last year and a half on COVID and a variety of issues, governors really have put themselves up as little kings and queens enacting policies on a whole host of issues, not to mention up in Washington, D.C. as well. But we're going to leave all that there and talk about an issue that's kind of near and dear to our hearts at the Rio Grande Foundation. We exposed Senator Martin Heinrich, U.S. Senator from New Mexico, and his ongoing effort to essentially get rid of natural gas as a home heating, as a water heating fuel, and the use of natural gas in your stove. It's Heinrich's belief that these are somehow dirty or harmful fuels. Of course, it all really boils down to supposed environmental impacts. And your organization, the Institute for Energy Research, has a new study. Natural gas bans will cost Americans trillions. Heinrich claims this is all going to come up roses, that it's not going to cost anybody anything, and that ultimately the transition will be essentially free. But your report, again, available at instituteforenergyresearch.org, seems to indicate differently, and it was just released, goodness, today. So very good timing there.
The timing is uncanny. Yes, that report is by my colleagues Alexander Stevens and Paige Lambermont. They did an excellent job on this report, looking into where these natural gas bans are being implemented and where the bans are being challenged, or where bans themselves are being banned. It's very complicated, and every state's got its own little battle going on. The epicenter, as it typically is for these environmental disputes, is here in the state of California, particularly in Northern California. I think Berkeley led the way, the city of Berkeley, and a couple of other Bay Area towns. I think perhaps even as large as San Jose, though. So that's a lot more than a town. That's one of the nation's biggest cities, if I have that correct, that they were part of this. But what you're seeing is a combination of different things. One element is banning new hookups. So when you erect a building and you're deciding, an apartment building, and you're deciding what sort of stoves you can put in these cities, the only option is for you to have your electric stove. The gas stove that so many of us enjoy cooking on, that chefs enjoy cooking on, is illegal in new buildings in these towns. And you've actually seen a bit of an uproar from the culinary community, because they recognize that, no, you can't get the same benefit from this other energy source. A gas stove is an essential part of their art. And that really speaks to the broader point of people having the freedom to use the sources of energy, the sources of fuel that best suit their needs. And this claim that, oh, it's actually going to be cheaper for us because, you know, there's volatility in natural gas prices or whatever. No, value is what the value we ascribe to something. And if I think that natural gas is worth more than having an electric stove for cooking, then I'm more than willing to pay a little more. But the thing is, this isn't going to save us money anyway. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is the rising electricity prices. California has unbelievably high electricity prices because it has so many silly policies like this. And when you cut off natural gas as an option, it drives up electricity demand, and it makes it even harder to come by. We're facing serious electricity crises here in California. And the idea that people elsewhere would want to follow us, whether it's on clean cars or on these natural gas bans, is quite silly. And the other element here, in addition to potentially banning the new hookups, is would we ever see a requirement for retrofitting, where you would have to tear out the existing natural gas hookup? That would be a whole order of magnitude more expensive, obviously. And that's where the real cost comes in. You can look at all of that broken down if you're interested at, again, instituteforenergyresearch.org. And this natural gas ban paper just came out today, which is August 17th. I would say the biggest factors there are the things that you've pointed to, which are that people should have the ability to use the energy sources that best suit their needs. And then, as I pointed to, we're actually making electricity more tenuous by putting everything on the grid, by electrifying everything. We're just going to exacerbate these self-imposed electricity problems that we have with the rolling blackouts and things. You combine the natural gas hookup bans with the fact that we are taking all of our nuclear off the grid in California, and it spells disaster.
Yeah, I went through the paper itself, like I said, instituteforenergyresearch.org, and there's some links in there that are incredibly useful. And one of them is from it's Thomas Tanton, President T2 and Associates, October 2020, Cost of Electrification, a State-by-State Analysis and Results. And so this report, which again is linked to in your report, looks at each state costs of electrification. New Mexico, $208 million for that, with a per capita, presumably per household cost of close to $100,000 for New Mexicans. That's, you know, obviously another cost is going to be added on to New Mexicans' backs. And it's the whole idea of whether this is green or not is a separate topic. And I largely addressed it in my opinion piece, which ran in several newspapers and also in National Review in a slightly extended format. But again, your paper, your organization's paper, does a really good job of highlighting the issue and breaking down some of the specifics for each state in the country. Government mandates, they always seem great for central planners and folks like Heinrich, but when it actually comes down to individual families and the impact these policies have on the bottom lines of people, it's not very good. And so anyway, it's a great report, and I'll definitely be looking at it and sharing it in numerous different formats, because boy, as I said to you before we got started, 15 years working at the Rio Grande Foundation on various public policy issues, and criticizing Martin Heinrich, Senator Heinrich, on his efforts to quote unquote electrify. I know how they shift the terminology around electrification. Sounds great, especially if you're old enough to remember the New Deal and people getting electric service in rural areas. Well, now electrification just means that you have to give up all of your existing appliances and buy the ones that Martin Heinrich tells you to buy. Very different approach.
It is different, and I want to get a bit philosophical here. You referred back to that Great Depression era where we were able to deliver electricity to a lot of people. Let's remember, there are millions, hundreds of millions of people globally that don't have electricity at all yet. And we're really starting to take that for granted here in the US. And as grim as this is to say, some of these crises we've seen in California, in Texas this past winter, they may be putting electricity back on people's radars and reminding us this is something we really need to fight for, and energy security more broadly as well. And that includes being able to use natural gas for a variety of its wonderful different applications. It's a terrific fuel. And as has been the case in New Mexico, it's something we've proven is in abundance in the US and can be a big part of our energy mix for a long time to come.
All right. Well, we will go ahead and leave it there. Thank you, Jordan McGillis, for your time. Can you please share again how people find your organization and your podcast?
Sure. We are the Institute for Energy Research. That's instituteforenergyresearch.org. And we also have a 501c4, a grassrootsy sort of organization that does some fun stuff with the more hard edge side of political engagement, getting on the ground and discussing things at the grassroots level and doing campaigns to try to make the public voice heard. That's American Energy Alliance. So we have the Institute for Energy Research, which is the more intellectual side of things. And then our activist side of things is the American Energy Alliance. We have a couple of podcasts. One of them is called the Plugged In podcast. And that's what we had you on, Paul. And that was with my colleague, Alex Stevens, who's a really strong contributor for us in a number of ways, as I've mentioned today. On the AEA side of things, American Energy Alliance, my boss, Tom Pyle, runs what's called the Unregulated podcast. So we've got a couple of different offerings out there. And IER is the more research-based, data-based, intellectual side of things. And then AEA, we have a bit more fun.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you very much for your time. And
Thank you.
Appreciate you sharing all your knowledge with us. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show. All right, Jordan, great job. Great information.